Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Josh Green, and I'm the director of the ICAP program, the Innovation Commercialization Assistance Program. We're based out of the Virginia SBDC and George Mason University, and we're funded in part by groups like VIPC, the SBA, CCI, Prince William County, and the National Science Foundation. We provide mentorship to early-stage Virginia-based tech and innovation-driven startups across the entire spectrum of the startup journey. We're very excited to be having our second session on technology transfer and university research commercialization. I'm excited today to get a little bit deeper into our topic that we started last week, and I will pass it along to our moderator, Sean Mallon from VIPC, to introduce himself and the rest of our panel for today. I hope everybody enjoys.
All right. Thank you, Josh, for this introduction. Yeah, so my name is Sean Mallon. I'm the VP for commercialization at the Virginia Innovation Partnership Corporation, which is a statewide and state-funded organization that supports early-stage technology startups as well as faculty members that are working on commercialization-related technologies within their university. So I'm delighted to be here today. Just wanted to take a second to kind of recap. We had the first of three sessions last Tuesday. This is the second, and we'll have a third one a week from now. So the first session last week was all about explaining to primarily research faculty at universities how to think about engaging with and understanding the technology transfer function within research universities and how to navigate that. And so we got into some detail, and I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with that, to go back and watch the video from that session. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about commercialization pathways. So less about kind of the how technology transfer works and more about taking your technology or your invention or participating in the taking of your technology or invention into the commercial world. So with that as a little bit of background, let me just kind of go down the line here and ask each of our co-panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Josh Malden.
Hello, I'm Josh Malden. I'm the Director of Licensing at the University of Virginia Licensing and Ventures Group.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Kevin, you're next on my screen.
Thanks, Sean. Kevin Leslie, Associate Vice President for Innovation and Commercialization at Old Dominion University.
Thank you. Hina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hina Mehta. I'm the Director for University Programs under Commercialization Division at Virginia Innovation Partnership Corporation.
Last but certainly not least, Brett Fagg from
Brett Fagg with Virginia Commonwealth University, Senior Licensing Manager.
Okay, well, thank you. Questions, if you want to ask more questions about the backgrounds of these individuals, they're all awesome people. You can save that for your questions. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of launch into 4 different scenarios for technology commercialization. These are not designed to be the end all and be all, but rather kind of typical commercialization pathways. And I'm going to ask Hina to kick us off with the first scenario that we've outlined, that we're going to outline for you, which is basically licensing your intellectual property to an existing established company. Hina, why don't you take us away?
Sure. Thank you, Sean. And thank you for all those who have joined today. So with that, like those who attended Tech Transfer Series last week, kind of, I'm sure you all took away some of the messages that what it is all about. When university secures intellectual property around all the innovation that happens within the walls of university, and it is kind of an incentive for faculty to keep innovation. However, there has to be some kind of an end goal, and that leads us to our today's conversation, which is commercialization. And so how do kind of we take these technologies to the end users, or the right people who would use it eventually in the marketplace, to be precise. So when we kind of talk about commercializations, there are always like multiple paths and multiple ways to do it. Is there a one size fits all? Probably not. Having said that, typically, two paths that comes to the mind right away is that licensing to an existing company. Shan, that you just mentioned that when kind of, universities decide that, okay, they would go out, take the technology, go out and start doing outreach to Merck, Pfizer, Amazon, Google, and start marketing those technologies, ask them, hey, we have this technology, we have this patent, and we really think that it would fit in your portfolio, and would you license it? So yes, that's a typical scenario. That is an ideal scenario, but it doesn't always happen like that. It depends a lot on the technology space, maturity level, whether the technology is de-risked to an extent where these larger companies would like kind of consider it, because they usually do not look at the technologies which are very early stage, like TRL 1, 2, or 3. They are not interested. They would really want to see technologies which are like technology readiness level is up to like 6, 7. It's very mature. You have de-risked it. And then it makes sense for them to kind of literally take that whole prototype or mature technology, convert it into commercially sellable format. Yes, in some cases, when it's a really novel therapeutics or medical devices, probably, yes, the companies would come forward because they really want to take that hands on those intellectual property very early on for their competitive advantage. So in this kind of scenarios, yes, existing company license would make sense. But most of the time, I would say like 99% of the time, it is going to be a startup around these technologies, where either faculty steps forward or an entrepreneur steps forward, or it is a faculty and entrepreneur kind of partnership. Those are the more scenarios where they can work together very closely until it reaches to a stage where it's attractive to a larger company.
That's great. A great way to kick us off, and I think you've opened the door up to the continuing conversation. So why don't we turn to Brent? And Brent, maybe if you could dive a little bit deeper into the one of the scenarios that Hina referred to, which is basically as a faculty member creating or being part of the creation of your own startup, and how that might work.
Certainly. So the process for the faculty startup really begins when we first start talking to the faculty member about their invention and they disclose the invention to us. One of the first questions we always ask them is, what is their intention moving forward with this? Because, regardless of who the licensee is, we always need their support. And with that, they'll express the need. They're like, we just want to out-license it. We don't want to do anything. And that's very clear. Others are kind of on the fence, and then others are very adamant that they want to do a startup. And in those situations, it is really important for us to have an open line of communication continuing going on with them. So the three primary events for most technologies are the disclosure, the protection of the IP, and then the licensing. But with faculty-led startups, we kind of act as a surrogate for a lot of those other business relationships, general advice, helping connect them with other resources, funding. So there is a lot more hand-holding. And it's a lot more ad hoc. I know we do the same things I'm sure other programs do, where we try to put together structured programs to help out startups. And those are great, but a lot of the stuff that we found is impactful is really ad hoc, where the faculty member going towards the startup says, here's what I need help with. And then we figure out how to connect them with the resources to plug those gaps, or to find the people that do have the right answers for them. And then eventually the startups get launched and they're successful. We have several that I've been working with for 3 or 4 years now, and they're just now hitting the market. So, but it was a very, and I say long relationship in a good way, not in it to imply it was bad, but And all that course, the license, which most people think is the most important, was honestly, maybe a month's worth of work throughout that whole, multi-year process. And we will keep supporting them, even though the license has been signed a year and a half ago. We still frequently support them going forward.
That's great, Brent. Thank you. And I'm starting to hear, and I think as we turn to Josh for some additional thoughts, just the criticality in all of these situations of the inventor encircling himself or herself with guides and mentorship, and tech transfer serves in that role. So, like you said, kind of by default, right? And I think we said this last week, like the first stop for any inventor or any faculty member that thinks that they might have something that the world could benefit from should be to the tech transfer office for open-ended conversations about, intentions and all of the other things that go with it. So, Josh, turning to you, if you could maybe dive into more of the model where there is a startup, right? There's a startup around the technology, but the faculty member is not necessarily the CEO, right? That there's somebody else, the faculty member is involved at some level, but not necessarily the leader.
This definitely builds on everything that Hina and Brent have already said, that if you look at all of our agreements, whether it's with an established company, a faculty startup, or a startup from some non-faculty group, most of the licensing terms are going to be very consistent across the agreement, because they're determined more by what the technology is and its stage of development, as opposed to what sort of we perceive the licensee might be able to pay, or things like that. I was really stressed in the first session. Broad dissemination of university knowledge is our guiding principle. It's not necessarily a return on investment. And so when we come up with licensing terms for a licensee, we're not factoring in like, hey, how much do we think they're willing to pay? Let's really push this and see if we can get like a lot of money out of this group, because we perceive that they have deeper pockets. It's more reflective of the stage of the technology, and is the company going to be able to move forward in a meaningful way, and building an agreement that helps to support those activities. With all of our licensees, we view the relationship as a partnership. We're here to be supportive of the licensee and try to make them successful. I've seen situations where there's almost like an adversarial relationship between the licensee and the licensor, but that's certainly not the relationship that we want to have and that we try to cultivate. So we see ourselves as partners in all of these agreements, looking for how we can best serve the technology to get to the marketplace. Differences between our agreements, if it is with a startup or with an established company, are usually in ways that we try to defer the financial consideration coming back to the university, with the idea that most startups are not going to have a lot of cash on hand. And so we don't want to burden them with large upfront payments and things like that. We would much rather they take the money that they have available and invest it in the technology and furthering its own development. And so for startups, we'll often take equity in lieu of an upfront cash payment as an upfront fee for the license, and try to do more things like that defer when we might actually receive the cash value of that consideration. Whereas a more established company is probably not wanting to give up equity and would much rather just give you a upfront cash payment to get access to the technology and things like that. For situations where we're licensing to a startup and the faculty member is not the CEO, in most instances, that startup wants the faculty member or one of the lead researchers to be involved in some way. They might not want them steering the ship as captain of this new startup, but they definitely appreciate the technical expertise that the faculty member provides. And so I would still anticipate the faculty member to be involved at some level, whether that's receiving founders equity in the company. They might be participating as a member of the scientific advisory board. They may be paid as a consultant on an ad hoc basis. The company may even be sponsoring research in the faculty member's lab as sponsored research. And so there's a lot of ways that the faculty member could still be involved. And I would say that in most cases, when we're doing a license to a startup that the faculty member is not the founder of, they're probably involved in some way. And again, with faculty-led startups, most startups, regardless of who starts it, probably don't have a lot of capital. That's not always the case. We have done startups that are backed by venture capital groups with billions of dollars under management. So that's not necessarily always true. But the technical terms of the agreement, the expectation for diligence milestones, and fair financial consideration are fairly consistent regardless of who we're licensing it to. Differences that I see when we negotiate a license with a startup that's not faculty initiated is more of how the deal progresses, the conversations that we have with them, maybe the sophistication of the discussions around the license agreement. As Brent pointed out, when we're working with a faculty member who's wanting to do their own startup, that's oftentimes a several years process as the faculty member is gaining the confidence that they want to take this step into forming their own company, potentially impacting their day job as a faculty member or postdoc grad student, whatever the case may be. When we finally start licensing a technology to a faculty startup, I may have had 10, 20 hours of conversations with them spread out over 1 to 2 years or even more in some instances. If we're talking to a separate startup, I would typically expect that they've probably built a startup previously. And so it's not their first time going through these negotiations. It's not the first time that they've built a company and led it through some type of exit partnership agreement with someone else. And so the discussions around the licensing typically progress faster. They're oftentimes bringing in a team of individuals to assist them, whether it's their technical experts, it could be outside counsel that's providing IP or other legal services like reviewing the agreements. If they've negotiated other agreements, they probably have ideas for some of the variations in language terms that could be in there. A faculty founder is probably not going to think to ask for anti-royalty stacking in a license agreement, but someone who's done an agreement previously probably would ask for that. And so those types of discussions come out more quickly. And in theory, we get these deals done more quickly just because you're talking to someone that's a little more sophisticated and has gone through the process before. But the actual terms that go into the agreement would be very similar if it's a independent startup, a faculty-led startup, or a license with an existing company.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh. And I think one of the themes that I'm hearing here too is just the flexibility allows for a faculty member to kind of pick his or her level of involvement. So if there's a faculty member that loves the teaching and loves the research, but happens to have these brilliant commercializable ideas, there's nothing that keeps them from continuing that academic career and letting someone else kind of run with the ball in terms of getting the product to market. And similarly, if someone wants to be more engaged, more of a hands-on role, there's that possibility as well. Josh, just a follow-up question for you while we've got you here on with your speaker on. How does UVA engage and I guess engage with your group of entrepreneurs in residence? How do they kind of play into company creation?
It varies. We've had some entrepreneurs in residence that started with the intention of founding a company based on University of Virginia technologies and sort of came into the group with that intention of, I'm going to do a startup. I just need to find what technology is the best fit for that. Other entrepreneurs in residence are advisory to existing startups. Some of them are advisory towards research teams. We've probably had close to 20 EIRs in the time that I've been here, and their level of involvement is, 20 different ways. It's unique to the EIR. Some of them are based here in Charlottesville and are able to have those regular routine meetings with research team to really build something. Other people are located in other parts of the country and are available for phone calls when more interesting things pop up. So it depends on the particular EIR. We also use the term EIR for some people we call entrepreneurs in residence. Some people are executives in residence that provide more logistical support for some of our existing companies with bookkeeping operations and things like that. So it really varies. But they all report to our seed fund and new ventures group. So the University of Virginia Licensing and Ventures Group has a seed fund that we use for supporting early stage companies, mostly those up to commercialize UVA technologies. We also invest in UVA alumni companies as well. And because they're investing in these startup companies, they have very close relationships with all of our startups. We also run an ICOR hub. We're members of the Mid-South ICOR hub and are about to be starting our second session through that system later this month with tools to actually take researchers and help them learn the questions to ask of, should I do a startup company? If so, is the product or service that we're looking to develop something that's actually going to solve a need that the market has? So the new ventures team provides a lot of assistance for our new ventures, connecting them with EIRs, connecting them with other investors, giving them advice on their own pitch decks as they're looking to raise money. So a lot of that stuff is handled on our new ventures team.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Kevin, turning to you. You have the you're going to explain to us how graduate students, PhDs, postdocs, and that ilk have an opportunity to be involved in startups as well. I think starting with perhaps your own experiences.
Yeah, happy to. And I think this is it's a really good segue from Josh's portion, because I think the licensing aspect, regardless of the founder of the startup, remains pretty similar. But this sort of pathway and profile for a postdoc or student-led startup is interesting, because I think it's often out of necessity, and for some technologies that tend to be a little earlier, and it also really requires a particular combination of things to line up. So as Brent had said, right, you talk to faculty about their intention with the technology, and there's that in-between group that says, hey, I still want to be involved, but I'm not leaving my tenure track position to go do this. But I happen to have a really, entrepreneurial minded postdoc or graduate student who's has an interest, but also has a really good grasp of the technology. So I think the real advantage to this profile is that you have somebody who has, an intimate working knowledge of the technology that we're talking about, but they're also at a time in their career where there's a little bit of flexibility and the opportunity to take a risk and try to do the startup venture. So, and I'll back up and say, the majority of the time, right, the students or postdocs that we're talking about are from the lab where the technology originated. I think it's pretty rare to do matchmaking sort of across the institution. sometimes that happens, but for the most part, it's people who have directly worked on that technology. I think the the disadvantage of this route, and Josh was talking about sort of the sophistication of the parties as we go through this, right? Somebody may be very technically capable, but this is somebody straight out of grad school who's stepping into often a CEO position for the startup as employee number one. So there's a little bit of that management, and then again, just the broader risk for the postdoc in taking this on. So as you mentioned, I did go through a version of this myself. So I was doing my PhD at VCU, and had actually gone through an I-Corps program for an unrelated technology that was based out of NYU. Really sparked my interest in that pathway, and I tried to take a lot of those learnings back with me to VCU and think about how we could commercialize some of the work in the lab. That startup ended up getting created. I was funded in the first year actually by a CRCF grant. At the time, the company's alive and well and has added a couple team members, and obviously I didn't stay, but that was partly young kids and my risk tolerance for that stage of a startup and venture. But it's a really it is a viable route so long as everybody knows what they're getting into, I think, at the outset. So the detail that I would add around it, having personally experienced and sort of this anecdotal way, but also just in the work that I do now, this adds just one more layer and variable to the complexity of trying to spin out the technology, particularly if you have a student involved, right? We're public institutions. There are very clear rules and policies around involving students in this kind of work. But even in the case of a postdoc, right, we have the consideration of existing intellectual property and really being careful in that early phase, particularly when people are applying for funding and STTRs or SBIRs, and making sure that they have really separated the startup company work and time from the university's resources, because I think that's where we see people getting into a tricky spot. Either they had no idea that they couldn't double dip in a sense and perform that work within the laboratories that are owned by the state. And similarly with their time, really mixing and working on the same kind of things in these two buckets. So my advice, both for faculty and for students or postdocs, is just being intimately familiar with the intellectual property and conflict of interest policies at the institutions, because those generally spell out exactly what you need to be careful of. But having those conversations, as everyone on the call has described, with the tech transfer office usually means you can avoid any of those issues, because you kind of identify them as you go along and build a plan to manage those. So I think from that side, having the strong relationship with the tech transfer office is going to help prevent 90% of the issues you would run into. But I think there are two other things that you really need in this student or postdoc led scenario. So the first is obviously a really strong relationship between that PI and the student and or postdoc. There's a lot of tension in any startup, but particularly navigating the relationship of leaving that sort of role where you're directly reporting to the PI, now sort of being in control independently and being able to have those conversations. And then, as a couple of folks have mentioned, there are a lot of resources out there. Often they are geared towards faculty, but it doesn't exclude postdocs and students in a lot of cases. And I think being able to seek out a lot of the training around how to do your business model development and these really fundamental things that augment the technical expertise are really important, especially if that person wants to stay with the company for any kind of long-term and before sort of the first official rounds, investment rounds, to be taken seriously at the helm there. So again, there are a lot of things available sort of locally, state, and nationally to cobble that together. But I will say this group, postdocs and students as founders, is, I think, probably one of the least supported. It's not as common, you know, given the complexity, but again, the resources are there to do it. So I would just advocate for those strong tech transfer relationships in any of these scenarios, but particularly this one because of the you know, the things you can trip over, and really, yeah, making sure there's a foundation educationally before making the jump.
That's great. I just if there were plugs a couple of times, so I'm going to make an explicit plug for next week's session, where we are going to explicitly talk about the I-Corp program and some of the benefits that can come from that. And then the other part of next week, we'll be talking about funding sources, very early stage funding sources from both federal, state, and private sources as well. So come back for that if you're interested in it. And so Kevin, thank you for that. And there are, you know, there are more and more opportunities for postdoc stipends, where if a graduate student, a postdoc, really wants to spend, you know, basically run an idea to ground, right? Go through ICOR or something like that. There's not kind of money falling out of trees, but if you go poking around a little bit, more and more there are some programs that will fund postdocs on a commercialization voyage. Okay, let's transition to the next part of our discussion, and to the extent that, you know, one of you all's comments have caused thoughts with other people's comments, feel free to bring those up as we continue. But specifically, I wanted to go around and kind of ask you guys to share with this group just some of the words of wisdom or bits of advice that you've maybe learned kind of in the school of hard knocks of being out there. And Brent, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier. The one biggest thing I can say is communication. It's, you know, we meet with so many different groups across the university, you know, like there was Kevin was saying, the conflict of interest, but it's not just that. We touch almost every part of the university, as well as a lot of outside groups. So communicating with us, what's going on, what problems area, what hangups are, things that you would like to go forward with. I can't tell you the number of times I've been able to match people with something that's going on with someone else. And it wasn't even what they came to us for in the first place. They just, you know, happened to mention it off the cuff, and we were able to help them out. So communication is, yeah, it is the number one tool that you have to work with us.
And with the caveat too, that having spent time at George Mason, and that's where he and I got to know each other, I've never met a technology transfer office that doesn't genuinely want to help the researcher or the person that they're talking to. So it's this notion of kind of a confrontational discussion is not something I've ever even come close to witnessing, and I hope that those who hear this presentation will be able to come away with that as a true statement. All right, Josh, what do you have for us in terms of words of wisdom?
One thing that I always touch on when I meet with faculty who are interested in doing startups is that it's not an extension of the lab. It's certainly not an alternative means of getting funding for your lab. I don't hear this often these days, but 10, 12 years ago, it wasn't uncommon for me to hear people in the community saying that, oh, the funding level for the NIH is really low, but the funding levels for the SBIR proposals are really high. And so you should start a company to get SBIR money to fund research in your lab. I don't view commercialization as fitting with that idea at all. I come from a family of small business owners, and the time that it takes to run a small business is way beyond what you would put into a job working for someone else. It's not something that I encourage people to enter into lightly. It's almost like I say, don't do it. And the people that are like, you know what, I got to do this. It's just driving me. And the ones that you can't sort of steer in the other direction are the people that are really going to be successful because of the amount of drive that it takes to really push things forward. A business isn't going to run itself. It's going to take a whole lot of work, way more commitment of time and energy and emotion than probably what most people are expecting when they go into it. So, you know, that's kind of my advice, is that you really be sure this is something that you really want to do and that you're doing it for the right reason, not just because you think, oh, I'm going to get an SBIR fund and that's going to keep my lab going for another couple of years.
Excellent. Thanks. Hina.
Yes, absolutely. I would say, like, you know, from the faculty perspective, having faculty understand when to draw the line when it comes to, you know, advising company. For example, we have had very successful scenarios at George Mason, when I was at George Mason, where faculty is involved heavily into, like, I would say, like, co-development piece of it, where faculty was involved into company as a, you know, scientific advisor. But in that case, I think it was very important that faculty remains engaged just as a scientific advisor and not as a business strategy person, because, you know, these are two totally different things. So having that, again, clear setting those boundaries is very important, because once, like, you know, for faculty, if they start like advising company CEO, okay, you know, this is the direction we want to go, and this only should be done while not being out in the market, can hurt them. So in that case, again, involving tech transfer office to kind of have that clear communication between these two parties becomes very important. And we were lucky that, you know, the faculty members were very, very reasonable, and they knew exactly what's their role. Be science, just advise on the science, and leave everything to this trusted person whom tech transfer has engaged to run the company. So I think that's very, very, very much important from when it is a co-development sort of scenarios.
That's great, Hina, and I think it, you know, it underscores what we've mentioned at least a couple of times, which is make sure you really like the people that you're working with, right? You're going to be, it's like a marriage, in the sense that you can't just kind of turn around one day and they're gone. Like you know, the moment there's kind of cross shareholdings or different, you know, differences of opinion. We ask the questions all the time when we're looking at startups and companies, like, how do you decide who makes what decisions, right? It's very important that founders, whether they have an academic participant or not, understand and amongst themselves really have almost like a commitment to, you know, these kinds of decisions. You know, I'm best positioned to make those kinds of decisions. You're best positioned to make. And then the CEO at the end of the day, whoever that is, ultimately kind of has a black ball oftentimes, and should, right? You need to have kind of the buck stops here kind of notion too, which is why, again, you need to like your partners, and you need to trust that they're going to make good decisions in areas that they understand better than you. Okay, Kevin, you get to wrap us up with your words of wisdom.
Well, Josh stole one of mine, because it is totally true that I have that conversation more often than I would expect, that you know, STTR money is a lot easier to get and the percentages are X, and it's like, hey, yeah, that not a good reason to go down that route. So I will second that. But I think the two things that I would add in there are that early engagement with the tech transfer office is critical for a couple things. I mean, you may have talked about this before in the last session, but the number of conversations I have where somebody says, oh, I already published this thing, but I really want to do the startup. And it's like, look, you shot yourself in the foot here. If you had talked to us, we could help. And it is not a, yeah, again, the sort of myth around the tech transfer office of stifling that kind of stuff. It really is to say, look, if that's your goal, we need to be really careful early on and make a plan. So I think that's one reason to do it. But the other is, particularly for the startup route, getting the exposure to the mindset shift for faculty who may have had no other business experience, that these are two totally different games, right? Scientific merit and commercial viability can be completely separate, and it's a really hard thing to adjust to. And so sort of doing that in baby steps, I think it tends to be more successful with that exposure, but being able to say, yeah, fantastic scientifically, but we have to be able to develop some kind of commercial pathway for this. And that takes trial and error takes time. So again, I would just say for those two reasons, that early engagement helps, faculty both protect themselves and also not waste their time, because a lot of times they can go down a path alone for a little while and realize, there wasn't actually a way forward with this thing. So yeah, I would just say that early engagement is really critical for those reasons.
Excellent. And for faculty that are watching or that will be watching this in the future, I think Hina taught me this, which is if you're going to go to a conference and give a talk about your new invention, go talk to tech transfer first. You may not have to have a patent filed the day you do the day you make your presentation, but there's all kinds of disclosure issues that come from getting in front of 100 people and telling them about your great idea and then trying to protect it afterwards. Right, Hina? Okay. All right.
One more thing that I might throw in that a couple of people have sort of touched on is building a team. When we're thinking of startups, and if it's a startup founded by the researcher, chances are they're the most abled technical person to be involved in that company, but they're probably not the best business person. If it's something in the therapeutic or medical device space, they're not going to have the regulatory know-how, and the sooner that they can get teamed with people that do have those skill sets, the more productive they're going to be. I can point to examples of licensees of ours that have been successful with just the technical founders and just getting SBIR money, but that's a limited type of technology that lends itself to that. Because UVA has a lot of technologies in the life sciences with the teaching hospital of the UVA health system, we see a lot of things in the therapeutic space. And a single person has zero chance of bringing a product to market in the therapeutic space without assembling a whole team of support around them. And so you want to get people who know what they're doing, and particularly even like if you're getting investments, to hopefully be getting money from investors that can also help you out, that they're knowledgeable in that space and can help point you in the right direction and help you solve problems when they come along. You want to be getting smart money.
Yeah, and I think I'm reminded of what we talked about at the very beginning of this session too, which is a big company that comes along and wants to license your technology. Just because you say that you've got a new molecule that's going to save the world isn't going to get them that excited. They might get them excited, but it's not going to get them off the dime. It's going to be having a team that has been able to kind of run it to ground, right? Not necessarily through, phase 2 trials or something like that, but at least validating the technology in early models and things like that. Big companies are too busy to go down a rabbit hole that isn't going to produce results. Okay, Josh Green, we're going to turn to you as our facilitator for questions that you're seeing coming in.
Perfect. Thank you. I had a list of about 12 questions, and I only have 5 remaining based off of all the great comments and information you all have already shared. If anybody from the audience would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat and I will put it in my list. I'll say the question, and then Sean, I'll leave it to you to see who you want to ping to have answer it or have a first go. The first one is, who finds the entrepreneur who will spin out the technology that I'm working on?
Who wants to take that one?
I can go first on that one. That is a great question, and I would say that's always a challenge, that who finds that entrepreneur. But in at least my experience, it is always comes through faculty member, because they know their technology best. They are going out meeting people who are interested in their technology, and even good entrepreneurs, I would say, who are really kind of, I would say, dedicated entrepreneur in some particular space, they are always keeping an eye on the research they are interested in. So they are keeping track through publications, the conferences, and things like that on with the faculty member, and they are usually the one who actually initiates these conversations. So I always at least told our faculty that, you are the best advocate for your technology, and same thing, they kind of are the people who are going to bring the best contacts as an entrepreneur. So that's I would say, yes, faculty is definitely the primary gateway to find those entrepreneurs. And of course, I will leave it to my colleagues who have this entrepreneur in residence kind of program. Probably they have a different kind of flavor to this and how they find these people.
I would say that in our situation, we're never placing an entrepreneur in position of running a company. We're happy to do introductions to the people that we have available in our network. But as has been pointed out earlier, the relationship between the entrepreneur and the scientific co-founders is really key. Can't really be stressed enough. And so it's up to them to find a match of the personalities and skill sets for what they're wanting to do. If it's not a match, it's definitely not going to work well when they actually get under pressure.
I just want to add too, I think one of the things that I've kind of pleasantly learned over the last few years is the power of customer discovery and the I-Corps program, specifically as it relates to academic teams, where basically you have to go out and interview a whole bunch of people. And you don't just kind of randomly bark up trees. You say, who are the likely people that could validate or help me invalidate my hypothesis? And you end up having 20, 30, 40, 50 customer discovery interviews. And I've been struck by how many people end up as advisors, right? Because so-and-so told them about somebody else, they called somebody else, and then they found someone that was like, I actually know a lot about this. I sold a company a few years ago. And so I-Corps, and we'll talk about it more next week, is can be kind of magical that way, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else in response to that question?
Yeah, I'll throw something out. So we've had this happen a few times recently, and it's where just like you were saying, the faculty member going out and finding it, but what they did is they went to angel investment groups, and they said, we're going to do our pitch. We're going to be looking for money. We're not there yet, which, it's always important to go talk to the groups before you actually need the monies to build a relationship. But then they followed up with saying, we're looking for expertise now. And the expertise they found were from those early stage investment groups, saying, hey, it's someone that on the teams that were like, this is actually my wheelhouse, and I have experience in this, and I would love to work with you on it. But again, it was faculty led, but that was where they went to find those entrepreneurs.
And thanks, Brent. And we'll talk more next week about the ICAP program specifically. Josh Green, I'm looking at you, but that is something where there are 15 mentors, I think, or something like that, Josh, in the ICAP network as well, some of which are very focused on life science companies and life science related technologies, and other things as well. And I think a lot of introductions have come through that. It's primarily, companies that have established themselves are in the process of doing that, but there certainly have been academic research teams that have participated in ICAP as well. Josh, next question, please.
Yeah, perfect. Question is, can I stay at the university if I want the technology spun out and I'd like to be involved?
I think we've hit on that a bit, but why don't if someone wants to take another crack at that one?
Yes.
Yes, you can.
Perfect. I think that hits the nail on the head.
There are innumerable pathways to the faculty member that range from virtually no involvement to I guess the point that was made around but that Josh Malden made, which is you will lose the rest of your life by starting a startup. So yes.
It is important to
Okay.
consider the level of commitment, because in addition to the conflict of interest, any institution is going to have a level of commitment that you're expected to provide as a full-time employee faculty member. And finding the appropriate balance there is something that does need to be brought up and addressed to make sure that the commitment is within what's allowed.
While we're kind of half talking about it, is there any guidance that this panel would give to tenure track faculty, right? So assistant professors that are hoping to kind of cross over the line into the associate professor category, stay away from spinouts, accept them with open arms. How should people think about that?
One thing we always mention to faculty that do really want to stick in their faculty position is, do you have any postdocs or grad students that are close to coming graduation that would be interested in being involved in the startup, and let them be the main person, and then the faculty members involved as a scientific advisory board member, consultant, something like that. But having someone else who's very intimately familiar with the technology that has a lower risk profile, that's willing to work in a startup environment.
Kevin?
I was just gonna echo that. I mean, I think it's the commitment levels and time are so significant in either direction that you really have to pick, and that the best sort of deferral strategy really is trying to find that postdoc or grad student who's going to be able to push it.
All right, Josh Green, what you got for us?
So I have two questions. One I think is fairly new as a topic. The other I think would just be to help close us out with something that was briefly touched on. So next question is, does a particular type of research or technology lend itself more to one type of path or the other?
That seems like a good question. And I think I'm thinking of kind of as a default setting, kind of life science versus non-life science, which probably would take a different path. Hina, do you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I think it would go back to what I had earlier mentioned, that it will all depend on the technology and what kind of, startup it is. It could be like, life science, where probably it is better off having a startup, de-risk it, to take it to certain, pre-IND enabling study kind of a level, and then reach out to the larger companies where they will be interested. And sometimes, like, very straightforward, say it's a software code that just needs to be integrated into some of imaging platform, for example. That might be better off that we just directly go to an existing company like GE, Siemens, and like try to reach out and market to them. Hey, this is the software, this can do, image processing cheaper, better, faster. Maybe it's the right fit for you, instead of trying to kind of, build something service model out of it. So it really depends on the technology field of the, research, stage of development.
Josh,
so there's no one right path.
We see startups across a broad swath of technology spaces, everything from life sciences, engineering to educational materials. There are probably some sectors that doing a startup would be more challenging. I'm thinking of something like, say, surgical devices, where there's so many large surgical instrument manufacturers that for you to start up and be a independent company trying to compete on that scale might be really challenging, because already those companies are working on really thin margins and they're going more on volume, and it'd be difficult for a startup to really be competitive in that space if the idea is like, hey, really, we just need to get sold to one of those larger surgical manufacturers, and that's really our end game. Then maybe just trying to license it directly to them is the way to go. But I would say that that's the minority of spaces, and it's something that you could easily find out through participating in an I-Corps program.
Another way to, I think, to look at that, look at an answer to that question too, is just the capital intensity of your path to market. in that I'm struggling to come up with specific examples right now, but if it was, kind of algorithmic and, nights and weekends, you could build a new piece of software that would solve an important problem for somebody. That's going to be a different scenario than a new drug or medical device or something like that, that by the time it actually makes its first commercial sale, 20 or 30 or $40 million has gone into getting it to that point. So, thinking about team is going to be different in those instances. The customer discovery is kind of the same concept, which is you got to work out kind of who's going to buy this in the end. But yeah, I think that would be an angle to look at that as well. Brent, did you want to say something?
I was gonna say, I think for us, a lot of it is how dependent your intended product is on other existing intellectual property. So some things it's really just an improvement or a niche component of a much larger system. And at which point you're just not going to be able to build a startup around it. You have to sell it or license to an existing company. But if you can package what you've created into a product that someone else is willing to pay for, then a startup is certainly and it may not be the best option, but it is an option. But I know we've all dealt with IP that you just don't have any room to play unless you license it to someone else who's already building the larger portfolio around that product.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We're looking at a company now that is basically building a plugin for a much larger software company that you would never dare to go after the big software company. But even with big companies, they have their focus and they have their areas of no focus. Like, we're just going to let partners do X, Y, and Z. So, this is just kind of a broad comment about competitive marketplaces. To entrepreneurs, to faculty members, like, I would say, don't be afraid of a competitive market. A competitive market means that there's actually a market there. There's actually an opportunity to make money in it. And being, the 1,000th person to come into a mature business is not necessarily a great idea. Being the 10th company to come into an emerging area that is predicted to be big is that's no bad thing. I mean, a lot of people are doing startups in their garages. You can't possibly know who they all are. But if you can build a product and bring it to market in a way that people actually solves their problems and they're willing to pay money for that, it doesn't matter if you're the 10th or even the 100th. Google was not the first search engine that was on the market by far. Robert Brook is tossing in a question. We have 1 minute left to answer it. Is there a large enough market to form a company similar to an inventor who just wants money to develop?
Less than a question, but more of a comment. The similar nature of, is there a big enough market for a spin out development of a university? I guess the question is, how much licensing help? Someone's developing something that's not going to be a big product itself to build a company around. The university tries to license things, correct? I mean, there's that route, which is less of the company building mentality, less of the entrepreneur founding, maybe not even SBI or STTRs because they're never forming a company to do it. But there's that other lower level of tech transfer that often, when you talk to the inventor, that, I don't want to build anything really. I just want to get at the point and then license it. And we see that sometimes at VIPC where we're like, how much effort do we want to put into this company if they're never really going to want to do more than just get it to the point then license it to whoever? And that's a question that's always
and I would say
limited resource.
The flip side of that too is finding someone that's actually interested in acquiring a license when there's not much of a market for something. So going after big ideas in big markets is always a smart thing to do. But then there are, I think to your point, Robert, there are pathways for things that aren't quite as world changing. It's 2:00. Josh, should we wrap this up?
Yeah.
Any other comments before we part from our esteemed panelists? All right. Well, thank you all very, very much. Josh Green, thank you for helping us to pull this together. And to all of our panelists, Josh Malden, Kevin Leslie, Hina Mehta, Brent Fag, thank you so much for being part of this. And hopefully we will get many people watching this over the months and years ahead, and we'll take a few lessons away.
Excited to have our final session next week that will cover state and federal programs to both support university faculty members as well as provide funding. So we'll hope to see everybody next week. And I'll also echo Sean's comments about thanking the panel for your time and wisdom today. And we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.